My name is Theodore Hayes. I am 68 years old. After working night shifts to pay the bills, I came home barely standing only to catch my wife cheating on me with my boss. Betrayed and broken, I was given an unexpected chance to change everything. This time, I would not let anyone hold me back. The payback begins right now. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who underestimated your worth. It was exactly 4 a.m. My joints ached from hauling heavy trash bins and mopping concrete floors for 8 straight hours. I turned the key in the front door of the home I had paid for over 30 long years. The house was dead quiet. A single sliver of light spilled from the master bedroom at the end of the hallway. I pushed the door open. My wife Cynthia was sitting up in our bed. Next to her, leaning against my own oak headboard, was Richard Lawson. Richard was 55 years old. He was also the regional director of the logistics center where I spent my nights wearing a stained gray janitor uniform. He was my direct boss. I stood in the doorway holding my plastic lunch cooler. Neither of them scrambled for the sheets. Neither of them showed a single ounce of panic or shame. Cynthia simply pulled her silk robe over her shoulders and looked at me with absolute boredom. Richard smirked. He ran a hand through his expensive haircut and looked at me the exact same way he looked at me when he ordered me to clean a spilled chemical in the warehouse. "You are home early, Theodore," Richard said. His voice was completely devoid of guilt. He spoke as if I had just interrupted a casual business meeting in his corporate office. Cynthia did not even flinch. She crossed her arms and stared at me with eyes that had turned to ice decades ago. "I told you he would be back by 4, Richard," she said it casually. She adjusted the pillows behind her back without breaking eye contact with me. I stood there. I let the heavy reality sink into my exhausted bones. My wife of over 40 years was sleeping with the man who signed my meager paychecks. I did not scream. I did not throw punches or break things. Anger requires energy. I had given all my energy to this family for far too long. "Get out of my bed," I said. My voice was low and steady. Richard let out a short, mocking laugh. He stretched his arms and swung his legs over the side of the mattress. I stared at him. He was the man who loved to belittle me during his morning warehouse inspections. He never knew the real reason a 68-year-old African-American man was pushing a broom in his facility. 5 years ago, my son Kendrick drove his startup business into the ground. He racked up $150,000 in debt to some very unforgiving creditors. Kendrick came to me crying. He begged for salvation. I stepped up to keep my only son out of prison. To cover that massive debt and keep our household running, I took the night shift job at the logistics center. I swallowed my pride. I ruined my back. I worked through the nights while Cynthia slept comfortably in the house I maintained. I sacrificed my golden years so my son could have a second chance and my wife could keep her luxury lifestyle. And this was my ultimate reward. The man I humbled myself for was now sleeping in my bed. He was invited in by the woman I swore to protect. Richard stood up and casually pulled on his expensive dress shirt. "You know, Theodore, since you are already awake and in your uniform, go down to the kitchen and make us a pot of coffee." He buttoned his cuffs without even looking at me. "Make it strong. I have a long day of executive meetings ahead of me." I remained planted in the doorway. "You are not getting coffee," I said. "You are getting out of my house." Cynthia let out a sharp sigh. She opened the nightstand drawer and pulled out a thick manila envelope. She tossed it onto the foot of the bed. It landed with a heavy thud. "Actually, Theodore, you are the one getting out," she said. Her tone was sharp and venomous. I looked down at the envelope. "What is that?" I asked. "Divorce papers," Cynthia replied smoothly. "They are already signed on my end. But that is not the most important document in there. You need to pack your things tonight." I looked around the room. I took in the absurd cruelty of the situation. "You are kicking me out of my own house. I paid the mortgage on this property for 30 years. Cynthia smiled a cold, calculating smile. "It is not your house anymore, Theodore. It belongs to Kendrick." I frowned. My mind raced to understand her ridiculous words. "That is impossible. The deed is in my name." "Not since last week," Cynthia stated flatly. "Kendrick and I handled the paperwork. We transferred the title. You signed the authorization form right before you left for your shift last Tuesday. You thought you were signing a tax extension document. You are getting old, Theodore. Your eyesight is failing. You really should read things more carefully before you put your pen on the line." She had tricked me. My own wife and the son I bankrupted myself to save had conspired to steal the roof over my head. They forged the intent. They disguised the document. They legally robbed me while I was preparing to go clean warehouse floors for their financial benefit. Richard chuckled from the corner of the room. He slipped on his designer shoes. You heard the Lady Theodore. The house belongs to Kendrick now, and Kendrick fully supports his mother finding happiness. Kendrick knows about this, I asked. The betrayal cut deeper than the infidelity. Kendrick knows. Cynthia confirmed. In fact, Kendrick is the one who introduced me to Richard. Now grab a trash bag, pack your dirty clothes, and leave. You are trespassing. A normal man would have broken down. A weaker man would have dropped to his knees and begged for an explanation. I did neither. I did not shed a single tear. The woman sitting on that bed was a stranger. The son who helped her steal my home was a traitor. And the boss buttoning his jacket was just a parasite. I looked at Cynthia one last time. I committed every detail of her smug face to memory. I turned around and walked down the hallway. I went to the hall closet and pulled out a sturdy canvas duffel bag. I methodically packed a few changes of clothes, my shaving kit, and a small metal lockbox I kept hidden on the top shelf. I did not take anything else. I did not need to. I walked to the front door. The sound of Richard laughing echoed from the master bedroom. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully discarded a tired old man who had outlived his usefulness. They believed I was just a broke janitor with nowhere to go and no power to fight back. They were completely wrong. I stepped out into the cool morning air and closed the door firmly behind me. I walked down the driveway without looking back. My shift as the sacrificial father and the dutiful husband had officially ended. The game was just beginning. They had absolutely no idea who they were truly playing against. The morning sun crawled through the dusty blinds of the cheap motel room I had rented for the night. I sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress. I held a cup of bitter gas station coffee in one hand and my cell phone in the other. My physical exhaustion was completely overshadowed by the cold clarity in my mind. I stared at the contact name on my screen. Kendrick, my only son. The boy I had ruined my own back to save. I pressed the call button. He picked up on the third ring. His voice was bright and entirely too cheerful for a man who had just helped steal his father's house. "Good morning, Dad," he answered smoothly. I bypassed the pleasantries. I asked him directly how long he had known about his mother and Richard Lawson. I asked him how he could forge my signature to take the house I paid for with decades of hard labor. There was a brief silence on the line. I expected a stammer. I expected an apology or at least a pathetic excuse. Instead, Kendrick let out a heavy sigh of annoyance. "Mom deserves to be happy, Dad." He said it with a chilling casualness. "You have been miserable to live with ever since you took that night shift. You are always tired. You are always complaining. Richard treats her like a queen. He takes her to nice places. You smell like industrial bleach and garbage. You cannot blame her for upgrading." I tightened my grip on the phone. Upgrading. My own flesh and blood reduced my decades of loyalty to a failed business transaction. I reminded Kendrick that I smelled like garbage because I was working to pay off the $150,000 he owed to loan sharks. I reminded him that my sweat kept him out of a jail cell when his reckless startup collapsed 5 years ago. Kendrick scoffed. "That was 5 years ago, Dad. You need to let that go. Besides, Richard is actually helping my career now. He just promoted me to operations manager at the logistics center. I get a corner office and a massive pay raise. All I had to do was facilitate a smooth transition at the house. It is just business. You always told me to look out for my future. I am doing exactly what you taught me." The sheer audacity of his justification was staggering. He had sold his father out for a corporate title and a corner office. Before I could respond to his breathtaking betrayal, I heard a sharp voice in the background. "Give me the phone, Kendrick. Stop wasting time with him." It was Megan, my daughter-in-law. Megan was a white woman from a wealthy suburban neighborhood who had always looked down on my family. She loved Kendrick's blind ambition but despised his roots. From the day they married, she made it her personal mission to drain every available resource from me while treating me like an unwanted servant. She hated my old truck. She hated my practical clothes. At Thanksgiving dinners, she would make snide comments about how my blue-collar presence was a stain on their upward social mobility. She was obsessed with country club status and designer labels. She was the one who constantly pushed Kendrick to demand more money from me to fund their unsustainable lifestyle. I knew instantly that this entire scheme to steal the house and align with Richard Lawson had her fingerprints all over it. Megan was greedy, manipulative, and absolutely ruthless. She grabbed the phone from my son without waiting for his permission. Listen to me very carefully, Theodore. Megan spat my name like it was a disease. You need to stop calling my husband. You are no longer part of this family's future. You are just a washed-up janitor who is dragging us down. Kendrick is an executive now. We have an image to maintain. We cannot have a trashy old security guard claiming to be the patriarch of this household. Enjoy the streets. You do not fit into our lifestyle anymore. Do not even think about trying to sue us for the house. You do not have a single penny to your name to hire a decent lawyer. While she was spewing her venom through the speaker, my phone vibrated against my palm. A new email notification popped up on the screen. I pulled the phone away from my ear for a second to look at it. The sender was the Human Resources Department of the Logistics Center. The digital signature at the bottom belonged to Richard Lawson. The subject line was written in bold red letters, "Immediate termination of employment." I opened the email. Richard stated that I was being fired without pay effective immediately. The official reason listed was suspicion of company property theft. They claimed several expensive tools had gone missing during my night shifts, and they were submitting a formal report to the authorities. They were completely cutting off my only visible source of income. They were framing me to ensure I was thoroughly ruined, financially, paralyzed, and legally threatened. They wanted me so desperate that I would crawl away and die quietly without putting up a fight. I brought the phone back to my ear. Megan was still talking. "I hope you enjoy the homeless shelter, Theodore." She laughed maliciously. I told her to check her tone. I told her she had no idea what she had just set in motion. Megan laughed harder. "What are you going to do? Hit us with a mop? You are a pathetic old man with nothing." I hung up the phone right in the middle of her manic laughter. I did not throw the phone against the wall. I did not panic. I simply sat there and let a cold, genuine smirk spread across my face. They really believed I was just a broke janitor. They truly thought my entire existence was defined by that stained gray uniform and a minimum wage paycheck. They had judged a book strictly by the dust on its cover. I took a slow sip of my coffee. The bitterness tasted like absolute victory. I opened my contacts and scrolled past the names of my ungrateful family members. I stopped at a number I had not called for aggressive professional reasons in almost a decade. Robert Hughes. Robert was a brilliant cutthroat attorney and a lifelong friend. More importantly, he was the man who managed the massive commercial real estate trust I had inherited from my grandfather. I kept that immense wealth entirely hidden from my greedy wife and son to force them to build their own character. Clearly, they had failed the test. I pressed the call button. Robert answered on the first ring. "Theodore, my old friend." "To what do I owe the pleasure this early in the morning?" he asked. "Robert," I said calmly, "it is time. The facade is officially over. They took the bait and they crossed the line. I need you to activate the trust protocols immediately. Prepare the documents. We are going to war." An hour later, I walked through the heavy glass doors of Hughes and Associates. The downtown law firm occupied the entire top floor of a towering skyscraper. The receptionist in her tailored designer suit gave my worn flannel jacket and faded jeans a cautious look. I did not care. I bypassed the waiting area entirely and walked straight down the mahogany hallway to the corner office. Robert Hughes was already standing behind his massive oak desk. He wore a sharp navy suit and had a stern expression etched onto his face. Robert and I had grown up on the same tough streets decades ago. He knew the absolute grit it took to build a life from nothing. When I walked in, he did not offer pity or empty sympathies. He offered a firm handshake and pointed to a leather chair across from him. I sat down and gave him the short version of the morning events. I told him about catching Richard in my bed. I told him about Cynthia kicking me out of the property. I told him about Kendrick and Megan participating in the theft of the house and the subsequent termination of my job. Robert listened with a cold, intense focus. He opened his laptop and began typing rapidly. He had access to my primary financial accounts for trust management purposes. His eyes narrowed at the screen. "Theodore, the betrayal goes much deeper than the house," Robert said. His voice was grim. He turned the laptop around so I could see the monitor. "Cynthia did not just hand you divorce papers today. She completely drained your joint checking and savings accounts early this morning." I leaned forward and stared at the bold red numbers on the screen. The balance was zero. $40,000 was completely gone. That was the money I had painstakingly saved from my backbreaking night shifts. Every single dollar in that account represented an hour of sleep I had sacrificed. Every $100 represented a weekend I spent repairing broken pallets and scrubbing warehouse floors instead of resting my aching joints. It was my safety net. Cynthia had transferred every last penny into an external account under her sole name. She timed it perfectly to leave me destitute the exact moment she handed me the eviction notice. She wanted me to have absolutely no resources to fight back or hire legal counsel. She wanted me sleeping on a park bench by tonight. I leaned back in the chair and exhaled slowly. $40,000 was a massive and devastating blow to an ordinary janitor. But Cynthia had made a catastrophic miscalculation. She forgot that I was not an ordinary janitor. Cynthia and my greedy son only knew about my blue-collar wages. They never knew my true identity. They did not know that my grandfather, a brilliant and highly frugal man, had purchased a massive 10-acre tract of undeveloped dirt on the edge of the city 60 years ago. As the city expanded over the decades, that worthless dirt became a prime commercial real estate hub. I was the sole heir and the legal owner of that multi-million-dollar property. The massive logistics center where Richard Lawson paraded around as regional director sat squarely on my land. Richard's corporation paid a staggering monthly lease to a blind trust that I controlled. Richard had absolutely no idea that the old janitor he loved to humiliate on his morning rounds was actually his ultimate landlord. I had kept this immense generational wealth completely hidden from my family. I wanted Kendrick to learn the value of hard work. I wanted him to build his own character instead of relying on a massive inheritance to solve his problems. I chose to live simply and work an honest job to set a permanent example of humility. That test had spectacularly failed. My family had proven their true colors. Robert pulled a thick file folder from his desk drawer and placed it squarely in front of me. The $40,000 is petty theft compared to what Richard and your wife are actually plotting, Robert said. He opened the folder and handed me a glossy document. Our firm constantly monitors the county property registry for any activity related to your trust. This was filed for processing yesterday afternoon. I picked up the paper. It was a formal land transfer and authorization agreement. It claimed to grant Richard Lawson the exclusive rights to purchase the 10-acre commercial lot for an absurdly low fraction of its actual market value. I scanned the bottom of the page. My signature was there in black ink. It was perfectly authentic. I stared at my own handwriting and my blood ran cold. Then the memory hit me like a physical blow to the chest. 3 months ago, Cynthia had brought me a thick stack of medical insurance forms. She claimed they were required for my upcoming physical exam. She hovered over me while I signed page after page. She told me to hurry because she had an appointment to get to. She had slipped this land transfer document right into the middle of the medical stack. They used my failing eyesight and my absolute trust in my wife of 40 years to steal a commercial property worth millions. Richard thinks he has found the ultimate corporate loophole, Robert explained. His tone was laced with professional disgust. By securing the land that the corporate headquarters desperately needs for their upcoming expansion, Richard secures his own position as a top executive. He used your own wife as his Trojan horse to get the signatures he needed. They think you are a senile old man who will not even realize the land is gone until the bulldozers show up. This is felony fraud, Theodore. We have the proof right here. Give me the word and I will have the police at the logistics center to arrest Richard before his lunch break. I will freeze Cynthia's accounts and we will drag Kendrick and Megan into a brutal legal battle for the house. We can crush them today. I looked down at the fraudulent document. I thought about Megan laughing at me over the phone. I thought about Kendrick selling me out for a corner office and a title. I thought about Richard smirking in my bed and telling me to go make him coffee. I placed the document gently back onto the desk. I raised my hand and looked Robert directly in the eyes. No, I said. Do not file the injunction. Do not call the police. Do not block the transfer. Robert frowned in deep confusion. Theodore, they are trying to steal your entire legacy. Why would we wait? Because I want them to think they have won, I replied. My voice was as cold as a winter night. If we strike now, they simply go to jail and claim it was a misunderstanding. That is entirely too easy for the amount of pain they have caused. I want them to pour every single dollar they have stolen into this garbage contract. I want Richard to proudly present this fraudulent victory to his corporate bosses. I want Cynthia to spend that $40,000 celebrating her new wealthy life. I want Megan and Kendrick to live way beyond their means in a house they do not actually own. Let them pop their expensive champagne. Let them plan their lavish vacations. Let them build their entire future on a foundation of quicksand. The trust structure makes this personal signature completely legally void anyway. An individual cannot sign away trust property without the board's approval. They are buying empty air. Robert slowly leaned back in his leather chair. A sharp, predatory smile formed on his face. He understood exactly what I was doing. "You want them to climb to the very top of the mountain before you cut the rope," he said. I nodded. "Let them invest everything they have into this illusion. They are going to bet their entire existence on a piece of paper that holds absolutely no legal weight. They thought I was just a tired old man pushing a broom. I am going to show them what a real boss looks like. When they have nothing left to fall back on, I will pull the ground out from under them." We wait. 2 days later, my burner phone buzzed with a text message from Cynthia. She demanded we meet at a rundown diner on the outskirts of the industrial district. It was the kind of place that smelled permanently of stale grease and burnt coffee. It was exactly the kind of place she would choose to meet a man she now considered beneath her. I arrived 10 minutes early and slid into a cracked vinyl booth. I watched the door. Cynthia walked in wearing a pristine white designer coat and oversized sunglasses. She looked around this grimy establishment with utter disgust before spotting me. She did not say hello. She did not sit down immediately. She stood over the table, opened her expensive leather purse, and pulled out a stapled legal document. She dropped it right next to my coffee mug. Then she reached into her wallet, pulled out 5 crisp $100 bills, and slapped them down on top of the paper. "Sign it, Theodore," she said. Her voice was flat and commanding. I looked down at the document. It was a post-marital asset waiver. The legal jargon was dense, but the objective was incredibly simple. By signing it, I would permanently surrender any right to contest the divorce. I would officially forfeit my claim to the house. I would waive any right to spousal support or the joint bank accounts she had already emptied. I looked from the paper to the $500 in cash. "You emptied an account with $40,000 of my hard-earned savings," I said calmly. "And you are offering me a $500 buyout." Cynthia finally sat down. She crossed her legs and let out an impatient sigh. "Consider it an act of charity," she replied. "That is enough cash to get you a bus ticket out of this city and a week in a cheap motel. You have no job, you have no house, you have absolutely no leverage. Richard has already processed your termination from the logistics center. You are a broke 68-year-old man with a ruined back. If you try to fight me in a divorce court, Richard will use his corporate attorneys to bury you under a mountain of legal fees you can never pay. Take the cash, sign the waiver. Walk away before I decide to take the $500 back." I stared at her. I watched her manicured fingers tapping impatiently against the scratched Formica table. I focused on her left hand. She was still wearing the diamond ring I had bought her 4 decades ago. Looking at that ring brought a bitter memory rushing back to the surface. 40 years ago, I was working double shifts at a local steel mill. My hands were constantly covered in deep blisters and cuts. I saved every single spare dime for 10 grueling months to buy her that modest diamond. I wanted to give her a symbol of my unwavering devotion. I remembered the night I got down on one knee in our tiny first apartment. I presented the ring with tears of pride in my eyes. Cynthia did not cry tears of joy. She did not hug me. She held her hand up to the cheap ceiling light, squinted at the stone, and asked me if the jeweler had a return policy because the diamond was embarrassingly small. She asked me how she was supposed to show off a rock that practically required a magnifying glass to see. I should have known right then. I should have walked out that very night. Her greed was never a phase. Her ruthless entitlement was not a product of our recent struggles. It was her core operating system. She was always a mercenary. I had simply chosen to be blind to it because I loved her. She had spent 40 years sucking the life out of my bones, and now that she thought the well was dry, she was moving on to her next wealthy host. Before I could respond to her insulting offer, the diner bell chimed loudly. I looked up and saw my son Kendrick walking through the door. Right behind him was Megan. My daughter-in-law looked around the greasy diner as if she had just stepped into a toxic hazard zone. She aggressively wiped down the vinyl seat with a napkin before sliding into the booth next to Cynthia. Kendrick slid in beside her. He could not even look me in the eye. He kept his gaze fixed on the salt shaker. Megan, however, was practically glowing with malicious energy. She did not bother with greetings. She slammed another document onto the table right next to Cynthia's asset waiver. "We are not just here for moral support, Theodore," Megan said. Her voice was dripping with condescension. "You need to sign this vehicle title transfer right now." I looked at the new document. "You want my truck?" I asked. I drove an old beat-up Ford pickup. It was not fancy, but the engine was bulletproof, and it was the only piece of property I had left to my name. "Kendrick needs a secondary utility vehicle," Megan explained casually. "With his new promotion as operations manager, we are remodeling our backyard to host corporate events. We need a truck to haul landscaping supplies and lumber. We do not want to ruin the interior of our luxury SUVs. You want to take my only mode of transportation so you can haul fertilizer to your country club home?" I asked. I kept my voice perfectly level. Megan rolled her eyes. "Do not be dramatic. You are nearly 70 years old. Your eyesight is clearly failing if you could not even read the paperwork for the house transfer last week. You are a liability on the road. Besides, where are you even going to drive? You do not have a job to commute to anymore. A washed-up janitor can easily take the city bus. It builds character. Hand over the keys and sign the title." I looked at my son. "Kendrick, you are really going to sit there and let your wife strip your father of his last possession?" I asked him. Kendrick finally looked up. His eyes were cold and empty. "It makes practical sense, Dad," he said softly. "You cannot afford the gas or the insurance anyway. Just sign the paper. Make this easy on everyone." They were cornering me. 3 vicious predators circling a man they believed was a wounded animal. They were systematically stripping away my home, my finances, my dignity, and my mobility. They were leaving a 68-year-old man with absolutely no way out. I looked down at my lap. I slowly reached my right hand into my jacket pocket. I did not pull out a tissue to wipe away tears. I felt the smooth surface of my smartphone. Without breaking eye contact with Megan, my thumb found the side button and double-clicked it. It was a shortcut I had set up earlier that morning. The voice recorder application launched instantly and began capturing high-definition audio from inside my pocket. "Let me get this completely straight," I said. I spoke loudly and clearly to ensure the microphone picked up every single syllable. "You are demanding that I sign away my legal rights to my $40,000, my marital home, and my vehicle." "Yes," Cynthia snapped. "And if I refuse to sign these documents right now?" I asked. Megan leaned across the table. Her face was twisted into a nasty sneer. "Then Richard will personally make sure you never work in this county again. We will use the Logistics Center corporate legal team to sue you for the allegedly stolen warehouse equipment. We will drag you through civil court until you owe hundreds of thousands of dollars in damages. We will garnish your Social Security checks. We will absolutely destroy you, Theodore. You will spend your final years rotting in a state-run nursing home. Sign the papers." I smiled. It was a small, dangerous smile that they completely failed to understand. "You have made your position very clear," I said. I reached forward and picked up the cheap plastic pen resting on the table. I pulled the vehicle transfer document toward me. I placed the pen on the signature line, but I did not write Theodore Hayes. I switched the pen to my left hand. I violently scribbled a series of jagged, illegible loops that looked like the handwriting of a panicked child. It was a completely botched, legally invalid signature. I did the exact same thing on Cynthia's divorce waiver. I scribbled a meaningless pattern of ink that no court or notary would ever accept. I dropped the pen. I reached out and calmly picked up the $500 in cash Cynthia had thrown on the table. I folded the bills neatly and slid them into my shirt pocket. "Thank you for the coffee money," I said. I slid the worthless, improperly signed documents back across the table. I stood up from the booth. "Enjoy your landscaping, Kendrick," I said to my son. I turned around and walked out of the diner. I left them sitting there staring at the botched paperwork. My phone was still safely recording in my pocket. I had just successfully captured 3 individuals committing federal extortion, coercion, and conspiracy on crystal-clear audio. They thought they had backed a helpless old man into a corner. They had just handed me the exact ammunition I needed to bury them alive. The very next morning, my burner phone rang. It was the Logistics Center main office line. Richard Lawson's administrative assistant ordered me to report to the regional director's suite immediately to discuss my termination and the missing equipment. I knew exactly what this was. I put on my old flannel jacket and took the bus to the facility. When I walked into the massive glass-enclosed office, Richard was sitting behind his polished mahogany desk. He looked like a king surveying his conquered territory. He did not ask me to sit. He turned a large tablet screen toward me and pressed play. The video footage was grainy and dark. It showed a figure wearing a gray janitor uniform, the exact same uniform I wore every night, loading heavy crates of expensive commercial power tools into the back of an unmarked van near the loading dock. The figure's face was completely obscured by a low-pulled baseball cap. It was a terrible forgery. Anyone with decent vision could see the man in the video was at least 20 years younger and 50 pounds lighter than I was. But the truth did not matter to Richard. He paused the video and leaned forward, clasping his hands together. "That is grand larceny, Theodore," Richard said smoothly. "The total value of the stolen equipment exceeds $30,000. That is a serious felony. Yes. If I hand this footage over to the police, you will spend the rest of your miserable life rotting in a state penitentiary. However, I am a generous man. I am willing to completely bury this footage. I am willing to forget the missing tools entirely, but my generosity comes with a price." He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a fresh copy of the Land Transfer and Authorization Agreement, the exact same document Cynthia had tried to trick me into signing 3 months ago. "You are going to sign this land over to me right now," Richard commanded. "You will sign it in front of a notary. You will surrender the property, and in exchange I will not call the police to arrest you for theft. You get to stay out of a jail cell and I get the land for the corporate expansion. Refuse and you will be arrested before you can even walk out of this building. The choice is yours." I stared at the frozen video on the screen, feeling a sharp, familiar pain twist in my gut. This was not the first time I had been confronted with the crime of theft to protect my family. When Kendrick was 17 years old, he got caught stealing $2,000 from the cash register of the local grocery store where he worked after school. The store owner was furious and ready to press criminal charges. A felony conviction would have destroyed Kendrick's chances of going to college. It would have ruined his entire life before it even started. I begged the owner for mercy. I emptied my own modest savings account and paid back every single stolen dollar plus interest to keep the police away. I took the blame, telling the owner I had pressured my son to take the money to pay our utility bills. I swallowed my pride and tarnished my own reputation to give my boy a clean slate. I covered his crimes so he could have a future. The heavy oak door of the office clicked shut behind me. I turned around. Kendrick stepped out from the shadows of the corner seating area. My son, dressed in a sharp-tailored suit that his new promotion paid for, stood shoulder to shoulder with the man who was sleeping with his mother. Richard smiled, a wicked, triumphant smile. "If you think you can simply deny the video, Theodore, you should know that I have an eyewitness ready to testify under oath," Richard said. Kendrick looked me dead in the eye. He did not flinch. He did not look away in shame. "I saw you, Dad," Kendrick said loudly. His voice was cold and completely detached. "I was working late on quarterly reports last Thursday night. I came down to the loading dock to get some fresh air. I saw you loading those crates into that van. I saw you steal the company property. If Richard calls the police, I will stand on a witness stand in front of a judge and jury, and I will swear under oath that I saw you commit the robbery." The sheer weight of his betrayal was suffocating. The boy I had saved from a prison cell was now actively participating in a conspiracy to frame me for a felony I did not commit. He was willing to send his own 68-year-old father to a maximum security prison just to secure his own corporate promotion. He was a complete monster, entirely devoid of a conscience. They had rehearsed this perfectly. Richard had the fake video, and Kendrick was the corrupt star witness. They thought they had backed me into an inescapable legal corner. They expected me to panic. They expected me to grab the pen and sign the land transfer document in a desperate bid to save my own freedom. I knew exactly how to play this hand. I let my shoulders slump forward. I let my hands tremble visibly. I looked at the floor, perfectly mimicking the body language of a broken, defeated old man who had just realized his life was over. "I cannot go to prison," I whispered. My voice shook with manufactured terror. "Please, Richard, I just need time. My head is spinning. Give me 2 weeks to get my affairs in order and process this. I will sign whatever you want. Just give me 2 weeks before you bring the notary." Richard laughed. It was a loud, victorious sound that echoed off the glass walls. He looked at Kendrick and smirked. 2 weeks, Theodore?" Richard agreed. "Not a single day more. Enjoy your freedom while it lasts." I turned around and slowly shuffled out of the office. I kept my head down until the elevator doors closed and took me to the ground floor. The second I stepped out of the building, my trembling stopped completely. I pulled my burner phone from my jacket pocket and dialed a private investigator Robert Hughes kept on a heavy retainer. I needed answers, and I needed them immediately. I ordered the investigator to pull every single financial record, offshore account, and shell company attached to Kendrick and Richard Lawson. They were playing a dangerous game, but I was about to change the rules. I spent the next 3 days living in a rundown motel on the edge of the industrial district. The small room smelled perpetually of old cigarette smoke and cheap industrial bleach. I sat in a sagging armchair near the window watching the flashing neon sign outside. I was waiting for the private investigator to deliver his initial findings on Richard Lawson. Instead, a sharp, aggressive knock echoed through the thin wooden door. I did not expect any visitors. I walked over and looked through the scratched peephole. Standing on the exterior walkway were my wife Cynthia and my daughter-in-law Megan. Standing right between them was a tall man wearing a pristine white medical coat and holding a black leather briefcase. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Cynthia pushed her way inside without waiting for an invitation. Megan followed closely behind her. The man in the medical coat stepped in last and firmly closed the door behind him. "Theodore, we need to have a very serious conversation," Cynthia said. She adopted a tone of exaggerated pity. It was the exact same patronizing voice someone would use to speak to a confused toddler. "We have been so deeply worried about you. Your behavior lately has been entirely erratic. You left the house in the middle of the night without a word. You are having severe memory lapses. You are imagining massive conspiracies. We had no choice but to intervene before you hurt yourself." I looked at the man in the white coat. "Who is this?" I asked calmly. "I am Dr. Evans," the man said. He offered a practiced and highly sympathetic smile that did not reach his cold eyes. "Your family contacted me regarding your rapid cognitive decline. They described severe symptoms of early-onset Alzheimer's disease. They noted your wandering away from home, your aggressive outbursts, and your extreme financial paranoia. They requested an emergency psychiatric evaluation to determine if you need to be placed in a specialized care facility for your own personal safety." I stared at him. I knew immediately he was not a legitimate doctor assigned by the state medical board. He was a paid actor. He was a corrupt physician Richard Lawson had likely hired from a private clinic to falsify a medical diagnosis for cash. They realized that extorting me for the land transfer might take entirely too long. If they could legally declare me mentally incompetent, Cynthia would automatically gain full medical and financial power of attorney as my legal spouse. She could sign the multi-million-dollar commercial property over to Richard without needing my signature at all. They were not just trying to steal my assets. They were trying to erase my legal existence entirely. I shifted my gaze away from the corrupt doctor and looked directly at Megan. She was standing near the motel bed with her arms crossed over her chest. She wore a look of intense fake sorrow plastered across her face. Seeing her play the role of a deeply concerned family member made my stomach churn with absolute disgust. 3 years ago, I took a second job cleaning a downtown luxury hotel to help pay for her extravagant anniversary trip to Paris. One evening, I walked out of the service elevator and saw Megan in the lobby lounge. She was passionately kissing a man in a tailored suit who was definitely not Kendrick. I waited and confronted her in the underground parking lot. She broke down in dramatic tears. She begged me to keep her dirty secret. She swore it was a one-time mistake fueled by alcohol. She pleaded with me not to destroy Kendrick's heart. My son had just recovered from his crushing business failure and was finally regaining his confidence. Megan looked me in the eye and told me that Kendrick would likely take his own life if he found out his wife was unfaithful. I knew a messy divorce would completely break his spirit. I chose to carry the heavy toxic burden of her secret to preserve his fragile happiness. I protected her marriage. I protected her lavish lifestyle. I kept my mouth completely shut to keep my family intact. This was my ultimate repayment. The adulterous woman I had shielded from public ruin was now actively conspiring to lock me inside a psychiatric ward to steal my wealth. Megan stepped forward. Her fake sorrow vanished instantly, replaced by a cold and vicious glare. "Do not make this harder than it has to be, Theodore," she said sharply. "You are losing your mind. You do not even know what is best for you anymore. Dr. Evans is going to write a prescription for a specialized memory care unit. You are going to pack your bags and go quietly. If you cooperate with us, we will make sure you get a nice room with a window view. If you fight us, it will be incredibly ugly." I stood my ground in the center of the cramped room. "I am not going anywhere," I said. "My mind is perfectly fine. You cannot force a sane man into a medical facility without a formal court order." Dr. Evans opened his black leather briefcase. He pulled out a small orange pill bottle and a plastic cup. He walked over to the motel sink and filled the cup with tap water. He walked back and held out 2 large white pills. "Actually, Mr. Hayes, I have the authority to mandate an involuntary psychiatric hold if I determine you are a direct danger to yourself or others," he said smoothly. "You are clearly experiencing an agitated delusional episode right now. I need you to take this heavy sedative to calm your nerves. It will make the transition to the medical facility much easier on your heart." He was trying to drug me. They wanted to knock me out so they could drag an unconscious and drooling old man into a waiting ambulance. Once I was inside a locked psychiatric ward with heavy chemical sedatives in my bloodstream, I would never be able to prove my sanity to a judge. They would pump me full of medications until my brain actually did turn to mush. Cynthia would sign the papers, and I would be left to rot in a white room for the rest of my natural life. "Take the pills, Theodore," Cynthia ordered. She moved her body to physically block the motel room door. "Take the medication right now, or Dr. Evans will call the paramedics to physically restrain you. We will tell them you threatened us with violence. You have absolutely no way out of this room. You have no money to fight us. It is over." Megan grabbed the plastic cup of water from the doctor. She shoved it aggressively toward my face. "Drink it," she demanded. "Stop being a stubborn old fool and swallow the pills. Nobody cares what a crazy janitor has to say. You are going to the hospital today, and Kendrick is going to take control of your life." I did not panic. I did not raise my voice or beg for mercy. I simply reached out and slapped the plastic cup straight out of Megan's hand with blinding speed. The water splashed violently across her expensive designer shoes. The plastic cup clattered loudly onto the dirty linoleum floor. Megan shrieked and jumped back, brushing her damp dress. Dr. Evans stepped forward aggressively, his hands reaching out to grab my shoulders to force me down. I held up my right index finger and pointed directly at the ceiling corner above the television set. "Before you lay a single finger on me, doctor, I highly suggest you smile for the camera," I said. My voice was dangerously calm and completely steady. All 3 of them froze dead in their tracks. They slowly turned their heads to look exactly where I was pointing. Tucked discreetly inside the plastic casing of the motel smoke detector was a high-definition motion-activated camera lens. I had purchased it at an electronics store 2 days ago and installed it the very moment I checked into the room. It was currently blinking with a tiny, almost invisible red light. That camera streams live video and crystal-clear audio directly to a secure cloud server managed by my attorney. I stated clearly, "You just broke into my temporary residence. You attempted to force-feed me an unidentified narcotic substance against my will. You threatened me with unlawful medical confinement and physical restraint. That is felony coercion, attempted assault, and severe medical malpractice. Your entire conspiracy has just been recorded in pristine quality." Dr. Evans dropped the white pills on the floor. All the color instantly drained from his face. He realized he had just destroyed his lucrative medical license and his personal freedom for a quick corporate paycheck. Cynthia and Megan stood completely paralyzed. Their arrogant, commanding smirks morphed into expressions of absolute terror. They had walked into my room fully expecting to trap a helpless prey. They just realized they had walked straight into a cage of my own meticulous design. Dr. Evans literally tripped over his own expensive leather shoes as he scrambled for the door. He did not say another word. He did not bother picking up the scattered white pills from the dirty linoleum. He just bolted into the hallway. Cynthia and Megan stood frozen for another second before the crushing reality of their massive legal exposure broke through their arrogant delusions. Without uttering a single threat, they turned and fled the motel room, leaving the door wide open in their panicked wake. I calmly walked over and pushed it shut. I slid the heavy metal deadbolt into place. As soon as the lock clicked, my burner phone vibrated on the cheap nightstand. It was the private investigator Robert Hughes had hired. The man did not waste time with pleasantries or small talk. He told me to open the secure encrypted link he had just sent to my email. I sat down at the small table and opened the digital file. The investigator had completely unraveled Richard Lawson. Richard was not just an arrogant regional director engaged in a cheap workplace affair. He was an active, highly reckless corporate embezzler. The documents glowing on my screen detailed a massive web of financial fraud spanning the last 6 months. Richard had been systematically siphoning operational funds from the logistics center. He categorized the missing corporate money as heavy equipment purchases, facility upgrades, and structural maintenance costs. This completely explained why he needed to frame me for stealing those warehouse tools. He desperately needed a convenient blue-collar scapegoat to account for the massive budget deficits he had created. But the most enraging part of the report was exactly where those stolen corporate funds were going. Richard had used the embezzled money to buy Cynthia a brand new luxury sports car. The dealership documents were right there on my screen. He had purchased a metallic silver convertible registered entirely in my wife's name. He was buying her loyalty and her physical affection with money he stole from the very company where I broke my back sweeping concrete floors. The investigator also uncovered a massive wire transfer initiated just 48 hours ago. Richard had moved a staggering $100,000 into a newly registered limited liability company. The sole proprietor of that shadowy shell company was my son Kendrick. Richard was directly funding Kendrick's lavish new corporate lifestyle. He was paying my son off to secure his complete cooperation in stealing my house and framing me for grand larceny. They were all feasting on stolen corporate cash while treating me like a disposable peasant. I stared at the complex financial routing numbers. I knew exactly how the logistics corporation operated at the highest levels. I had spent years quietly observing the corporate structure while emptying their office trash cans and cleaning their executive boardrooms. The national headquarters operated with absolutely ruthless financial oversight. They were currently in the final stages of negotiating a massive multi-billion-dollar merger with an international shipping conglomerate based out of Europe. Because of this highly sensitive, impending merger, the corporate board of directors had implemented a strict zero-tolerance policy for any budget discrepancies. Their internal auditing division was famous in the industry for tearing regional directors apart for misplacing a few $100s. Richard was playing an incredibly dangerous game of financial roulette. If the corporate auditors caught even a slight whiff of his missing operational funds, he would not just lose his comfortable executive job. The corporation would immediately hand him over to federal authorities for embezzlement, wire fraud, and corporate sabotage. Richard was bleeding the company dry to fund his illicit affair with my wife and to bribe my greedy son into submission. He was arrogant enough to believe he could outsmart a team of forensic accountants. My phone rang abruptly, breaking the silence of the motel room. The caller ID showed a blocked number, but I knew exactly who it was. I accepted the call and held the device to my ear. "Theodore, we need to meet right now," Richard demanded. His voice was completely stripped of its usual smooth, mocking arrogance. He sounded breathless, frantic, and entirely unhinged. The confident executive who had smirked at me from the comfort of my own bed was entirely gone. "I have the land transfer documents ready." He continued rapidly, his words stumbling over each other. "You do not get 2 weeks anymore. The timeline has officially changed. You need to come to my office and sign the commercial property over to me today." I listened to his rapid breathing through the speaker. I knew exactly why he was panicking. The private investigator had noted in his report that the National Corporate Audit Team was scheduled to begin preliminary regional reviews by the end of the week. Richard had drained too much cash from his operational budgets to hide. He could not mask the missing funds much longer. He desperately needed my 10-acre commercial property. If he could legally acquire the multi-million-dollar land asset for a fraction of its actual cost, he could present the drastically undervalued real estate deal to the corporate board as a massive win for the company. The immense value of the newly acquired land would completely overshadow the missing warehouse funds on the balance sheets. He would look like a brilliant negotiator who secured the perfect location for their new expansion. The corporate executives would overlook the budget anomalies, and Richard would secure a massive promotion instead of a federal prison sentence. My stolen land was his only get-out-of-jail-free card. I kept my voice weak and trembling. "I cannot come in today, Richard," I stammered, playing the role of a broken, terrified old man perfectly. "I am sick. My chest hurts. Please, you promised me 2 weeks to figure this out. I just need a few more days to gather my belongings." Richard slammed his fist against his desk. I could hear the loud thud echo through the phone. "I do not care about your chest, Theodore," he snarled viciously. "You will be at my office by tomorrow morning to sign those papers. If you do not show up, I am calling the police and handing over the footage of you stealing those warehouse tools. I will have you dragged out of whatever gutter you are hiding in handcuffs. Tomorrow morning, do not test me." He hung up the phone with a violent click. I lowered the phone from my ear. The manufactured terror vanished from my face, instantly replaced by a cold, genuine smile. Richard thought he was holding a loaded gun to my head. He had absolutely no idea he was standing squarely on a landmine, and I was holding the digital detonator. I opened my secure laptop. I booted up an encrypted email server that could not be traced back to my location or my IP address. I drafted a direct high-priority message to the chief financial officer and the head of internal auditing at the logistics corporate headquarters. I did not write a long emotional complaint. I simply attached the detailed financial dossiers the private investigator had just provided. I included the specific routing numbers for the embezzled funds, the dealership receipt for Cynthia's luxury sports car, and the official wire transfer records for the $100,000 sent directly to Kendrick's shell company. I added a single concise sentence to the body of the email. I strongly advise you to initiate an immediate surprise inspection of Richard Lawson's regional branch before your impending merger is publicly compromised by severe internal fraud. I checked the attachments one final time to ensure the evidence was undeniable. I moved my cursor over the send button. I clicked it without a single ounce of hesitation. The email vanished into the digital ether, rocketing straight toward the highest levels of corporate power. Richard Lawson wanted to rush the timeline to save his own skin. I was more than happy to oblige. The storm was coming, and he had absolutely nowhere to hide. The morning after I sent that digital bomb to the corporate auditors, I had one more vital piece of business to handle. Before Richard's entire world collapsed, and the resulting financial panic infected my greedy family, I needed to secure my own bloodline. I took a short cab ride to the downtown branch of my primary bank. I walked through the heavy revolving glass doors. The lobby was lined with polished marble and filled with quiet, respectful patrons. But that respectful silence was currently being shattered by a shrill, demanding voice echoing from the premier teller windows. It was Megan. My daughter-in-law was pounding her manicured fist against the granite counter. She was screaming at a terrified young bank clerk. She demanded to know why her withdrawal request had been denied. She shouted that she needed $20,000 in cash immediately and that the bank was illegally holding her money hostage. I stood back for a moment and watched her melt down. Kendrick and Megan were clearly feeling the initial squeeze of their precarious financial situation. With Kendrick's new corporate salary not yet hitting his bank account, and Richard likely distracted by the sudden freeze on his embezzled funds, Megan was desperate for quick cash to maintain her country club facade. She was trying to raid the only account she still had secondary access to. I buttoned my worn flannel jacket and calmly walked across the lobby toward the commotion. 10 years ago, the day my grandson was born, I walked into this exact same bank building. I opened a dedicated high-yield education trust fund. I wanted to guarantee that regardless of what happened in the world, that innocent boy would have his college tuition paid in full. I funded it entirely with my own money. Every single month for a decade, I quietly deposited a portion of my earnings into that account. I designated myself as the primary custodian and the sole owner of the funds. I only listed Kendrick and Megan as secondary authorized users with the strict legal stipulation that the money could only be withdrawn for approved educational expenses. Over 10 years, that account had grown to a very substantial amount. It was a fortune meant for a child's future. Now Megan was attempting to drain her own son's college fund to buy designer clothes and fund her lavish lifestyle. I had anticipated this exact move. Early this morning, I made a direct phone call to my private wealth manager and placed a hard, impenetrable freeze on all secondary access to the trust. Megan finally turned away from the trembling clerk and spotted me approaching. Her face instantly twisted into a mask of pure rage. "You!" she shrieked, pointing an accusing finger directly at my chest. "You locked the account! Tell this incompetent teller to release my money right now!" She stomped toward me, completely ignoring the shocked stares of the other bank patrons. I stood my ground. "That is not your money, Megan," I said, clearly keeping my voice perfectly level. "That trust fund is for my grandson to attend a university. It is not a slush fund for your shopping sprees. You have absolutely no right to touch a single penny of it." Megan let out a loud, theatrical laugh. She looked around the lobby, gesturing to me as if I were a circus act. "Look at you," she mocked loudly. "You are wearing a dirty jacket and cheap boots. You are a washed-up, unemployed janitor who sleeps in a trashy motel. Do not stand here and lecture me about money. You have nothing. Kendrick and I are the future of this family. You are just a pathetic burden we are finally cutting loose. Unfreeze that account immediately, or I swear I will make sure you never see your grandson again." Her cruel words echoed off the marble walls. She thought public humiliation would break me. She expected me to shrink away in shame. Instead, I looked at her with absolute disgust. "I will not let a greedy, adulterous thief steal a child's future," I replied. "I know exactly who you are, Megan. I know what you did in that hotel lobby 3 years ago. I know you are nothing but a parasite feeding off my son's delusions." Her eyes went wide. The color completely drained from her face as the realization hit her. I knew her darkest secret. Her shock quickly transformed into violent, uncontrolled fury. She lost her mind. Megan raised her hand and swung it with all her might. She slapped me hard across the left side of my face. The sharp crack of her palm hitting my cheek silenced the entire bank lobby. I did not raise my hands to defend myself. I did not retaliate. I simply turned my head back and stared at her. Megan stood there breathing heavily, her hands still raised in the air. Suddenly, the heavy glass doors of the executive suite swung open. Mr. Mitchell, the senior branch manager, sprinted across the lobby. "Mr." Mitchell personally handled the massive multi-million-dollar commercial trust I held with the bank. He knew exactly who I was, and he knew exactly how much power I possessed. He pointed directly at Megan. "Detain that woman immediately." Mr. Mitchell shouted to the armed security guards standing by the entrance. "Do not let her leave this building." 2 large guards rushed forward and grabbed Megan by the arms. She began to kick and scream, demanding they let her go, shouting that I had threatened her first. Mr. Mitchell ignored her completely. He pulled out his phone and dialed emergency services. He ordered the police to respond to an unprovoked physical assault on a senior citizen. 10 minutes later, 2 city police officers marched into the bank lobby. They reviewed the security camera footage that clearly showed Megan slapping an elderly man without any physical provocation. They pulled her arms behind her back and locked heavy metal handcuffs around her wrists. Megan sobbed uncontrollably as they marched her past me. She begged me to tell them it was a family misunderstanding. I did not say a word. I watched in total silence as my ruthless daughter-in-law was shoved into the back of a police cruiser to be booked for felony assault. I returned to my bleak motel room after watching the police cruiser drive away with Megan. The satisfaction of seeing her in handcuffs was entirely temporary. I knew a simple assault charge would not keep a woman with her resources locked up for long. Exactly 2 hours later, a heavy knock pounded on my door. It was not the tentative knock of a maid. It was a violent, demanding strike that rattled the thin wooden frame. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Richard Lawson stood on the exterior walkway. His normally pristine, expensive suit looked slightly disheveled. The veins in his neck were visibly pulsing. Right behind him stood Cynthia. Her face was pale and drawn. Richard stepped into the small room aggressively and kicked the door shut with the heel of his shoe. He did not waste time with casual pleasantries. He marched right up to my face. He told me he had just spent $10,000 bailing my deranged daughter-in-law out of a city jail cell. He said Megan was currently sitting in his car outside nursing bruised wrists and a shattered ego. Richard shoved his hand into his leather briefcase and pulled out the land transfer and authorization agreement. He slammed the document down hard on the cheap motel table. "The game is entirely over, Theodore," Richard growled. He leaned in close enough for me to smell the stale coffee and pure anxiety radiating off him. "You have pushed my patience past its absolute breaking point. I gave you time to process the situation. I offered you a clean exit. Instead, you humiliate my operations manager at the bank and play games with my schedule. I need this land signed over to me by the end of business today. If you refuse to pick up a pen and sign your name right now, I will not just call the police about the missing warehouse tools. I will make a phone call to some very unpleasant associates who operate strictly outside the law. They specialize in collecting debts and breaking bones. They will find you in this filthy motel room tonight. They will drag you into the alley and shatter both of your kneecaps with steel pipes. You will spend the rest of your miserable life drinking your meals through a straw in a charity ward. Do not test my resolve today. I am a desperate man holding all the cards." I looked at the contract on the table. The threat of physical violence was a brand new escalation. Richard was no longer playing the role of a slick corporate executive. He was acting like a cornered street thug. The pressure from the impending corporate audit was clearly driving him completely insane. I knew Richard was not making an empty threat. During my years cleaning the executive suites at the logistics center, I overheard plenty of hushed conversations about his ruthless rise to power. Richard Lawson did not climb the corporate ladder by being a brilliant strategist or a fair negotiator. He climbed it by being an absolute monster. 10 years ago, he systematically bankrupted 3 independent trucking companies by hiring local gangs to slash their tires and physically intimidate their drivers. He drove honest working men to total financial ruin just so his corporation could absorb their delivery routes for pennies on the dollar. He ruined families without a single ounce of remorse. He viewed human lives and livelihoods as acceptable collateral damage in his pursuit of a larger annual bonus. He was a corporate predator who used street-level violence whenever legal intimidation failed to produce results. Threatening to cripple an elderly janitor was completely within his standard operating procedures. He was fully capable of making good on his promise. Before I could respond to Richard's brutal ultimatum, Cynthia rushed forward. She completely abandoned her arrogant posture. She threw herself onto her knees right onto the dirty linoleum floor. She grabbed my jacket and squeezed the fabric tightly in her fists. Tears began to stream down her face in a sudden theatrical display of pure agony. "Theodore, please," she sobbed loudly. Her voice was trembling with manufactured terror. "You have to sign the paper. You have to do it for me." I looked down at the woman who had cheated on me, kicked me out of my home, and tried to lock me inside a psychiatric ward just a few days ago. "What are you talking about?" I asked, coldly. Cynthia wiped her eyes purposefully, smearing her expensive mascara across her cheeks to look more pathetic. "I lied to you," she cried. "I did not just empty the bank accounts to start a new life. I am in terrible trouble. I owe a massive amount of money to some very dangerous men, the exact same loan sharks Kendrick dealt with 5 years ago. I borrowed money in secret to maintain the house and buy luxury items to impress my friends. The debt has ballooned completely out of control. They are threatening to kill me, Theodore. They told me if I do not pay them back by tomorrow morning, they will put a bullet in my head. Richard is my only way out. He promised to pay off the loan sharks and save my life, but he will only do it if you sign the land over to him. You have to sign it. You are my husband. You promised to protect me." I stared at her in sheer disbelief. It was the most pathetic, transparent performance I had ever witnessed. I knew for an absolute fact that Richard had bought her a luxury convertible and transferred $100,000 to Kendrick just 2 days ago. There were no loan sharks threatening her life. There was no underground debt. She was regurgitating the exact same story Kendrick had used 5 years ago because she knew it had worked on my conscience once before. She thought I was stupid enough to fall for the exact same emotional manipulation. She was utilizing fake tears and fabricated death threats to guilt me into surrendering a multi-million-dollar property. She was willing to debase herself on the floor of a cheap motel just to close a real estate deal for her lover. I let my shoulders drop. I let out a long, heavy sigh. I looked at Richard's aggressive posture and then down at Cynthia's tear-stained face. I feigned absolute defeat. I acted exactly like a man whose spirit had been entirely broken by fear and guilt. "Fine," I whispered softly. "I will sign the document. Just leave me alone." Richard slammed a gold-plated pen onto the table. Cynthia sprang up from the floor, her fake sobbing instantly vanishing. I picked up the pen. I leaned over the table and signed my name on the bottom line of the Land Transfer and Authorization Agreement. I made sure my signature was crystal clear and perfectly legible. Richard snatched the paper off the table the second the ink was dry. He inspected the signature with hungry, manic eyes. He let out a loud shout of pure triumph. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a bottle of expensive champagne and 2 crystal glasses. He popped the cork right there in my tiny motel room. He poured a glass for himself and one for Cynthia. They clinked their glasses together and drank. They smiled at each other with unbridled greed. They celebrated their ultimate victory right in front of the man they believed they had just destroyed. They had no idea that the signature they were toasting was legally void. They had no idea they had just signed their own corporate death warrant. The corporate storm finally made landfall exactly 3 days after I signed that worthless piece of paper in my motel room. It was a Tuesday morning. The logistics center was operating at its usual frantic pace when a fleet of black SUVs pulled up to the main entrance. The doors swung open and a team of pristine corporate auditors marched into the facility. They moved with the cold, ruthless efficiency of a military strike team. They bypassed the front desk completely and headed straight for the executive suites on the top floor. The team was led by Mr. Collins, the ruthless head of internal auditing from the national headquarters. I was not there to see it in person, but my private investigator had sources inside the building who relayed every single detail of the massacre. Richard Lawson was sitting behind his mahogany desk when the glass doors of his office swung open. He did not panic. He did not break a sweat. He truly believed he was completely untouchable. When Mr. Collins and his team of 4 forensic accountants surrounded his desk, Richard simply leaned back in his leather chair and offered a smug, victorious smile. He thought they were there to interrogate him about the minor budget discrepancies. He was fully prepared to play his ultimate trump card. Before Mr. Collins could even open his mouth to demand the financial ledgers, Richard confidently reached into his top drawer. He pulled out the land transfer and authorization agreement. He slid the document across the polished wood directly toward the head auditor. Richard proudly declared that the minor operational deficits were completely irrelevant. He boasted that he had just single-handedly secured the multi-million-dollar 10-acre commercial property they needed for their massive international merger. He claimed he had negotiated a phenomenal deal that would save the corporation millions. He sat there waiting for a standing ovation. What Richard did not know was that he had just handed the corporate auditors a legally binding confession of attempted real estate fraud. He was far too arrogant to perform basic legal due diligence. If he had hired a competent title researcher, he would have discovered the ironclad truth about my property. My grandfather had not simply put a deed in his name. He had established the Hayes Family Commercial Trust over 60 years ago. The trust was structured with absolute legal precision. An individual beneficiary could never sell, transfer, or liquidate the land using a personal signature. Any transfer of ownership required a unanimous vote from a legally appointed board of trustees, a registered corporate seal, and months of probate court approvals. My personal signature on that piece of paper held the exact same legal weight as a toddler scribbling with crayons. Richard saw an old, tired janitor and assumed he could bully his way into a fortune. He bypassed the legal department because he wanted all the corporate glory for himself. He wanted to present the stolen land as a surprise gift to the executives. Instead, he had just handed them a forged, useless piece of trash. Mr. Collins did not applaud. He did not smile. He picked up the contract, briefly scanned my signature, and dropped it back onto the desk like it was diseased. "This document is completely worthless, Richard," Mr. Collins said. His voice was sharp and devoid of any emotion. "Our legal department reviewed the property registry this morning after receiving a highly detailed whistleblower report. That land is owned by a blind commercial trust. Theodore Hayes does not have the unilateral legal authority to sign it over to you or to this corporation. You just tried to extort an elderly employee for a piece of paper that holds absolutely zero legal value." Richard froze. His smug smile vanished instantly. The color drained from his face as he stared at the contract. He opened his mouth to stammer an excuse, but Mr. Collins cut him off completely. He slammed a thick black binder onto the desk. "We are not here to discuss your failed real estate scams, Richard," Mr. Collins stated loudly. "We are here to discuss the hundreds of thousands of dollars missing from your operational budgets." Mr. Collins opened the binder. It contained every single piece of evidence I had anonymously emailed to headquarters. He pulled out the dealership receipts for the luxury silver convertible Richard had purchased for my wife Cynthia. He pulled out the bank routing numbers showing massive daily withdrawals disguised as warehouse maintenance costs. He pulled out the official wire transfer documents proving Richard had sent $100,000 to a shadowy shell company owned by my son Kendrick. Richard began to visibly shake. He was sweating profusely. He frantically pointed at the door, claiming he had video proof that a janitor had stolen the warehouse equipment. He shouted that he was being framed. Mr. Collins simply shook his head in absolute disgust. "Do not insult my intelligence," Mr. Collins snapped. "Our IT department analyzed that security footage 3 hours ago. It is a pathetic digital forgery. The timestamps were altered, and the employee in the video does not even match the physical description of Theodore Hayes. You bled this regional branch dry to fund your illicit personal affairs, and you tried to frame an innocent blue-collar worker to cover your tracks. You have severely compromised our upcoming international merger." While Richard was desperately gasping for air and trying to formulate another lie, the glass doors to the office opened one more time. 2 uniformed city police officers walked in. Right behind them were 2 federal investigators wearing tactical jackets. The Logistics Corporation did not play games with their money. When they realized the scope of Richard's embezzlement, they had immediately contacted law enforcement. Mr. Collins looked down at the trembling regional director. "Richard Lawson, you are officially terminated from this corporation effective immediately," Mr. Collins declared. "You no longer have any authority, access, or rights within this facility." One of the police officers stepped forward and ordered Richard to stand up and put his hands behind his back. Richard tried to resist. He cried out that he was a senior executive and demanded to call his lawyer. The officer ignored him completely. He spun Richard around, pulled his arms back, and locked heavy steel handcuffs tightly around his wrists. The federal investigators immediately began seizing his desktop computer, his digital tablet, and his leather briefcase. They boxed up every single document in his office as physical evidence of corporate fraud. Richard was dragged out from behind his mahogany desk. The police marched him directly through the center of the regional office. Dozens of employees, managers, and warehouse workers stopped what they were doing to watch their untouchable, arrogant boss being paraded through the building in handcuffs. He was humiliated in front of the entire staff. The man who had mocked me while sitting in my bed was now a disgraced criminal suspect heading straight to a holding cell. The first domino had officially fallen. The rest of my treacherous family was next. Theodore Hayes did not stay in my thoughts for long as the events of that evening unfolded perfectly according to my design. Richard Lawson did not stay in a concrete holding cell for long either. A man with his level of corporate connections and a high-priced defense attorney always knows how to pull a frantic emergency lever. Before the federal authorities could secure a comprehensive freeze on all his hidden personal assets, his lawyer managed to post a massive cash bond. Richard walked out of the county jail late that very same evening. But he did not walk out as a confident regional director. He walked out as a completely ruined, desperate man facing decades in federal prison. He had lost his lucrative career, his pristine reputation, and his absolute authority. His mind was spiraling into a dark, violent panic. He knew the fraudulent land contract was the catalyst for his sudden destruction. He realized that the ignorant janitor he had openly mocked was actually the architect of his demise. With his bank accounts facing imminent seizure, Richard had only one immediate source of liquid capital left to secure his legal defense. He needed the assets he had foolishly handed over to his mistress and her greedy son. Richard took a taxi directly to my old address. He did not bother knocking on the front door of the house that Cynthia and Kendrick had stolen from me. He kicked the heavy oak door open with enough force to splinter the wooden frame. Cynthia was sitting in the living room pouring herself a glass of expensive red wine, likely celebrating what she assumed was her permanent victory over me. The crystal glass shattered on the hardwood floor when Richard stormed into the room. He was breathing heavily, his eyes wide and bloodshot. He marched straight toward her and wrapped his hands violently around her throat. He slammed her back against the wall. He demanded the immediate return of the silver convertible. He screamed at her to transfer the $100,000 back into his account that very second. He spat in her face, accusing her of setting him up with a fake land deed. He told her she was going to sell everything in this house to pay for his criminal defense lawyers. This violent implosion was exactly what happens when you build a relationship entirely on the foundation of stolen money. Cynthia traded a loyal, hardworking husband for a man who could offer her the illusion of high society wealth. She confused financial bribery with genuine affection. Richard did not love her. He simply bought her loyalty with embezzled corporate funds to stroke his own massive ego. When a romance is strictly transactional, it shatters the very second the money dries up. There is absolutely no honor among thieves. The moment Richard lost his corporate credit cards and faced the terrifying reality of a federal prison sentence, Cynthia instantly stopped being his romantic escape. She immediately became his scapegoat and his emergency ATM. Love purchased with stolen cash transforms into violent, uncontrollable resentment when the bill finally comes due. They were bound together by greed, and now that greed was tearing them apart. The sound of the splintering front door and Cynthia gasping for air echoed up the main staircase. Kendrick was upstairs in the master bedroom. He had already moved into my old room, claiming his position as the new patriarch of the stolen household. When he heard his mother choking, he sprinted down the stairs. Kendrick stopped dead in his tracks when he saw his powerful corporate mentor, the man who had just promoted him to operations manager, violently assaulting his mother in our living room. The fragile alliance they had built to destroy my life instantly evaporated. Kendrick let out a furious shout and tackled Richard to the hardwood floor. The two men crashed into the expensive glass coffee table, shattering it into 1,000 jagged pieces. Richard was older, but he was fueled by absolute manic desperation and pure rage. Kendrick was younger, but he was softer, completely accustomed to sitting comfortably behind a desk rather than throwing actual punches. They rolled across the floor, trading brutal, uncoordinated blows. Richard punched Kendrick squarely in the jaw, splitting his lip open and sending blood flying across the expensive white rug Cynthia had recently purchased. Cynthia recovered her breath and saw her son losing the physical fight. She completely lost her mind. She grabbed a heavy brass lamp from the side table, ripped the cord from the wall, and swung it down hard against Richard's shoulder. Richard roared in pain and backhanded Cynthia, knocking her to the floor. It was a pathetic, bloody spectacle. The sophisticated corporate executive, the smug, entitled wife, and the arrogant, ambitious son were reduced to feral animals. They were brutally fighting over the scraps of a ruined scheme inside the very house they had illegally conspired to steal from me. They were literally tearing each other apart, doing my job for me. Unbeknownst to the three of them, they were not fighting in private. Robert Hughes had instructed his private investigator to maintain constant surveillance on Richard the absolute second he posted bail. The investigator had followed Richard's taxi straight from the county jail to my old neighborhood. He parked his unmarked vehicle quietly across the dark street. When Richard kicked the front door open, the investigator simply stepped out of his car and walked right up to the massive front bay window. This was the exact same large window Cynthia had insisted I install years ago, so she could show off the interior of our home to the passing neighbors. The investigator stood in the shadows of the front yard holding a high-definition night vision camera. He recorded the entire violent assault through the pristine glass. He captured Richard choking Cynthia Kendrick, tackling his former boss, and the bloody, chaotic brawl that followed. The investigator did not attempt to intervene. He simply pulled out his cell phone, dialed the local police precinct, and reported a violent domestic disturbance in progress. He then directly forwarded the live, high-definition footage of the assault to the responding officers. The trap I had set was now completely closed. They had destroyed themselves on camera. The morning after the violent, chaotic brawl at my former home, the real heavy artillery was officially deployed. I sat in Robert Hughes's corner office, sipping a cup of dark roast coffee, watching the digital delivery confirmations roll across his computer screen. We had orchestrated a perfectly synchronized legal strike. At exactly 9 a.m, professional process servers approached 4 different locations simultaneously. Richard Lawson received his thick envelope of legal doom as he stepped out of his criminal defense attorney's office downtown. Cynthia and Kendrick were served at the local police precinct, where they were still dealing with the humiliating fallout of the previous night's domestic violence charges. Megan was served at her wealthy parents' suburban estate, where she had fled after posting bail for her bank assault charge. The documents they received were not simple civil complaints. They were massive, heavily bound packets detailing an avalanche of severe criminal and civil charges. Robert had drafted a flawless legal assault that left absolutely zero room for negotiation. The summons outlined multi-million-dollar commercial fraud, grand larceny felony, elder exploitation, and identity theft. But the absolute centerpiece of the lawsuit was the devastating charge of conspiracy to commit medical kidnapping and fraudulent psychiatric coercion. We attached the high-definition video stills of Dr. Evans holding the heavy sedative pills in my motel room. We included the sworn written statement from the corrupt doctor himself, who had immediately flipped and confessed everything to Robert to save his own medical license and avoid federal prison. The legal packets detailed exactly how the 4 of them had conspired to drug an elderly man, strip him of his fundamental human rights, and lock him inside a mental asylum solely to drain his financial assets. They were no longer just facing the loss of their stolen money or their social status. They were staring directly down the barrel of a decade in state prison. The sheer weight of the legal documentation was expertly designed to induce total psychological collapse. They thought they were the apex predators orchestrating a clever heist against a helpless target. Now they were holding the undeniable proof that they were nothing more than cornered prey. This devastating legal blow was not assembled overnight. Robert Hughes was a master architect of courtroom warfare. While I was playing the role of a terrified broken janitor in a cheap motel room, Robert was working ruthlessly behind the scenes. He had spent the last several weeks building an impenetrable fortress of hard evidence. He did not just collect the hidden camera footage and the financial wire transfers. He subpoenaed the metadata from their cell phones. He mapped out every single text message and phone call, coordinating their theft, cross-referencing the digital timestamps with their physical locations. He researched state statutes on elder exploitation to ensure the maximum mandatory sentencing guidelines applied to their specific actions. Robert treated the law like a high-stakes chess match, and he always thought 10 moves ahead of his opponents. He knew exactly how arrogant people like Richard and Megan operated. They always left a sloppy trail of digital breadcrumbs because they genuinely believed they were smarter and vastly superior to everyone else in the room. Robert took those arrogant breadcrumbs and baked them into an ironclad legal conviction that no high-priced defense attorney could ever successfully dismantle. The crushing reality of Robert's legal masterpiece did not take long to detonate. Just hours after the process servers delivered the packets, my burner phone vibrated on the mahogany desk. The caller ID displayed a number I recognized immediately. It was Megan, the arrogant country club-obsessed daughter-in-law who had slapped me across the face in a crowded bank lobby was now calling me in a state of absolute panic. I answered the phone and put it on speaker so Robert could listen to the collapse. Megan did not start the conversation with her usual condescending insults. She was hyperventilating. She sounded like a terrified child who had just realized she was locked inside a burning building. "Theodore, please listen to me," she begged. Her voice was shaking uncontrollably. "You have to call your lawyers off. My parents read the court summons. They are threatening to completely disown me and cut off my inheritance. I cannot go to prison. I would not survive in a place like that. I will lose my mind." I let her cry into the receiver for a few seconds before I spoke. "You should have thought about the prison environment before you tried to force-feed me heavy sedatives, Megan," I replied coldly. She immediately started shifting the blame. She abandoned her husband without a second thought. "It was not my idea." She screamed defensively. "It was Cynthia and Kendrick. They forced me to go along with the motel plan. They told me that if I did not help them get you out of the picture, we would lose everything and Richard would fire Kendrick. I was just a victim of their intense manipulation. You have to believe me." Her desperation was utterly pathetic. She was perfectly willing to throw her own husband and her mother-in-law directly under the legal bus to save her designer wardrobe and her suburban social status. "I can help you, Theodore," Megan continued frantically. "I know everything they did. I know exactly which offshore account Cynthia used to hide the $40,000 she stole from your joint savings. I can testify against Kendrick in court. I will stand on the witness stand and tell the judge that they orchestrated the entire psychiatric evaluation scam from the very beginning. I will be your star witness. I will give you everything you need to lock them away. Just please grant me immunity from the civil lawsuit. Tell your lawyers to drop my name from the criminal complaint." I looked across the desk at Robert. He leaned back in his leather chair and shook his head with a quiet, satisfied smile. We already had all the evidence we needed. Her testimony was entirely useless to us. I turned my attention back to the phone. Megan was taking heavy, jagged breaths, waiting for me to offer her the financial and legal lifeline she felt she inherently deserved. I did not offer her a single ounce of mercy. "I remember our conversation in the bank lobby very clearly, Megan," I said. My voice was steady and completely devoid of emotion. "You looked me right in the eye and told me I was a washed-up, unemployed janitor. You laughed in my face in front of dozens of people and told me I was a pathetic burden. You explicitly stated that a trashy old security guard who sweeps garbage did not fit into your luxury lifestyle." Megan began to sob loudly into the receiver. "Please, Theodore, I did not mean any of it. I was just angry about the trust fund. I was stressed. I am so deeply sorry." I cut her off instantly. "I am exactly what you said I was," I replied. "I am the man who cleans up the trash, and right now I am cleaning my family of all the garbage that has infected it. You once told me I was a garbage-sweeping janitor. Do not beg garbage to save you." I pressed the end button and permanently blocked her number from the device. I set the phone face down on the desk. The first legal blow had successfully shattered their fragile alliance. They were completely turning on each other exactly as I had planned. Despite the crushing weight of the federal indictments and the civil lawsuits bearing down on him, Richard Lawson possessed a level of narcissistic delusion that bordered on sheer madness. Instead of hiding in shame and preparing his legal defense, he decided to double down on his public image. He believed that if he could just project an aura of absolute success and untouchable power, he could secure the private investors he desperately needed to fund his exorbitant legal fees. He proceeded with hosting the highly publicized annual Commerce and Logistics Charity Gala at the Grand Plaza Hotel. It was a desperate, calculated move to convince the local business elite that his termination was a mere corporate misunderstanding and that he was still a kingmaker in the commercial real estate world. He forced Cynthia to attend the event by his side. Cynthia was an absolute nervous wreck. The brutal domestic altercation from a few nights ago had left her visibly shaken, but Richard commanded her to put on her expensive designer gown and plaster a fake smile across her face. He needed her to play the role of the devoted high society partner to legitimize his standing. They arrived at the grand ballroom projecting an image of total unity. but anyone looking closely could see the sheer panic sweating through their expensive pores. Cynthia stood by the lavish ice sculptures, gripping a glass of champagne so tightly her knuckles turned completely white. She constantly glanced at the heavy double doors of the ballroom, terrified that the police would storm in at any moment to execute the arrest warrants detailed in the lawsuit. Richard mingled with the wealthy guests, laughing too loudly and aggressively, pitching new, entirely fabricated investment opportunities. He was acting like a man who was not currently out on bail for multi-million-dollar corporate fraud. He slapped local politicians on the back and kissed the hands of wealthy socialites desperately trying to secure his financial lifeline before the federal prosecutors officially froze his remaining hidden accounts. He paid for the extravagant catering, the string quartet, and the open bar using the very last reserves of credit he had available. He paraded Cynthia around the room like a trophy he had rightfully earned, completely ignoring the reality that she was just as legally compromised as he was. They were two desperate criminals masquerading as philanthropists in a room full of people they were actively trying to con. The entire ballroom was a sickening display of manufactured glamour and absolute superficiality. The local elite, operated in a world built entirely on fake smiles, whispered rumors, and ruthless financial posturing. Everyone in that glittering room had likely read the business tabloids. They all knew Richard had been escorted out of his corporate headquarters in steel handcuffs just days prior. Yet they still showed up in their tailored tuxedos and diamond necklaces to drink his expensive champagne and eat his imported caviar. They did not care about morality or integrity. They only cared about proximity to power and the potential for profit. It was a venomous ecosystem where loyalty was strictly transactional and human worth was measured entirely by stock portfolios and bank balances. For decades, I had scrubbed the scuff marks off floors in buildings just like this one, so people like them could dance without dirtying their shoes. I knew their world intimately from the shadows. I knew that the second a man lost his capital, these same smiling aristocrats would eagerly watch him drown without throwing a single life preserver. They were vultures circling a wounded animal. At exactly 8 o'clock, the heavy mahogany double doors of the grand ballroom swung open with a resounding thud that echoed over the soft string quartet. The ambient chatter of the wealthy guests instantly died down. I walked through the grand entrance. I was no longer wearing the stained gray janitor uniform or the faded flannel jacket that defined my manufactured blue-collar persona. I was wearing a meticulously tailored, bespoke midnight blue suit crafted from the finest Italian wool. My shoes were polished black leather. My posture was perfectly straight, projecting the absolute authority of a man who actually owned the ground he walked on. I did not walk in alone. To my immediate right was Robert Hughes, looking like a ruthless legal gladiator carrying a sleek leather briefcase filled with undeniable destruction. To my left and directly behind me was a highly coordinated squad of federal agents and economic police officers wearing dark tactical vests over their dress shirts. The visual impact of our arrival was entirely devastating. The crowd of socialites and businessmen immediately parted like the Red Sea, stepping back rapidly to create a wide, clear path directly through the center of the ballroom. They stared at me in absolute shock. A few of the corporate executives from the logistics center who had attended the gala recognized my face. I could hear their confused gasps as they realized the old security guard they used to ignore was leading a federal strike team into their elite gathering. Cynthia was standing near the front of the room. She dropped her crystal champagne flute. It shattered against the marble floor, but nobody even flinched at the sharp noise. Her jaw dropped and her eyes widened in pure, unadulterated horror. She was staring at a man she had completely underestimated for 40 years. She was looking at the true manifestation of the generational wealth she had tried so desperately to steal through cheap tricks and fraudulent medical paperwork. I did not look at her. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the main stage at the front of the room. Richard Lawson was standing behind a clear acrylic podium. He had been right in the middle of a self-aggrandizing speech about his visionary leadership and his upcoming independent real estate ventures. When he saw me walking down the center aisle, flanked by law enforcement, the color completely drained from his face. His arrogant smile collapsed into an expression of profound, inescapable doom. I did not stop walking until I reached the bottom of the stage steps. The federal agents fanned out across the front of the room, strategically blocking every single exit to ensure nobody could slip away. Robert Hughes stood at the base of the stairs, crossing his arms and watching the absolute destruction of his legal opponents unfold with a satisfied grin. I climbed the short staircase slowly and deliberately. Every single step echoed loudly in the dead, silent ballroom. Richard stood completely frozen behind the podium. He was entirely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his public downfall. He gripped the edges of the acrylic stand so hard his knuckles turned white. He tried to open his mouth to speak, to offer some pathetic excuse or assert his non-existent authority, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He was a broken man looking at his executioner. I stepped right up to the podium. I looked deep into his terrified, bloodshot eyes. I saw the exact moment his massive ego shattered into a million irreparable pieces. I reached out and calmly took the microphone right out of his trembling hand. He did not resist. He simply let it go and took a pathetic step back, shrinking away from my dominant presence. I turned to face the massive crowd of wealthy investors, corrupt corporate executives, and my treacherous, cheating wife. I tapped the microphone twice. It was time to end this. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen." I spoke directly into the microphone. My voice boomed through the massive concert speakers surrounding the ballroom. "My name is Theodore Hayes. Most of you know me as the invisible janitor who empties your trash at the Regional Logistics Center. Richard Lawson knows me as the vulnerable old man he tried to extort. What none of you know is that I am the sole owner of the multi-million-dollar commercial trust that currently leases the very ground Richard's corporation sits on." The collective gasp from the wealthy audience was instantaneous. I did not pause to let them recover from the shock. I raised my left hand and gestured to Robert Hughes, who was standing by the primary audiovisual control booth at the edge of the stage. Robert slammed a flash drive into the main console and pressed a single illuminated button. The string quartet had completely stopped playing. The only sound in the room was the mechanical hum of the massive dual projector screens lowering from the ceiling directly behind the stage. The screens flickered to life. I stepped aside so Richard and the entire audience had a perfectly clear view of the broadcast. The hidden camera video from my cheap motel room began to play in stunning high definition. The pristine audio of Dr. Evans holding the heavy sedatives echoed through the grand ballroom. The elite crowd watched in absolute stunned silence as Cynthia physically blocked the motel door on the massive screens. They heard Megan threaten me with unlawful medical confinement. They heard the corrupt doctor admit he was hired to fake an Alzheimer's diagnosis to forcibly lock me inside a psychiatric ward so they could seize my financial assets. Richard stood completely paralyzed next to me as his meticulously crafted public image was slaughtered before his eyes. But I was not finished. Robert switched the feed to the audio recordings captured by the private investigator. The ballroom was suddenly filled with Richard's own arrogant voice. The crowd listened closely as Richard bragged to Cynthia about embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars from the corporate operational budgets. They heard him explicitly detail how he used the stolen money to buy Cynthia a luxury silver convertible to fund their illicit affair. They heard him violently threaten to hire street thugs to shatter my kneecaps if I refused to sign a fraudulent land transfer document. The sheer brutality of his recorded threats completely contradicted the sophisticated philanthropist persona he had presented just 10 minutes prior. I broadcasted his absolute criminal rot to every single wealthy investor he was attempting to con tonight. The reaction from the high society crowd was swift and absolutely merciless. These were ruthless business people who operated in a world of cutthroat deals, but they possessed a profound hatred for sloppy, desperate criminals who tried to drag them into federal fraud investigations. The wealthy socialites who had been drinking Richard's expensive champagne just moments ago literally dropped their crystal glasses onto the marble floor. They physically recoiled, stepping back quickly to create a massive ring of isolation around Cynthia. The politicians and investors Richard had been aggressively courting realized instantly that they were attending a gala funded entirely by stolen corporate cash. The whispered rumors erupted into loud, furious murmurs of sheer disgust. They looked at Richard and Cynthia not with pity, but with profound revulsion. They saw them as highly toxic liabilities. The polished aristocrats pulled out their cell phones and began frantically texting their own legal teams to completely sever any financial ties they had recently discussed with Richard. Cynthia was suddenly standing entirely alone in a sea of judging, hostile eyes. The social elite she had sacrificed her marriage to impress were looking at her as if she were a contagious disease. The lead federal agent did not wait for the audio recording to finish playing. He marched straight up the stage steps with a heavy, purposeful stride. Richard tried to take a step back, raising his hands in a pathetic attempt to negotiate, but his voice completely failed him. The agent grabbed Richard violently by the shoulder and spun him around. He slammed Richard face first against the clear acrylic podium. The sharp thud echoed loudly through the microphone. The agent pulled Richard's arms roughly behind his back and clamped heavy steel handcuffs tightly around his wrists. "You are under arrest for violating the conditions of your federal bail, witness intimidation and conspiracy to commit severe medical fraud," the agent stated loudly, reading him his rights as he dragged him away from the podium. Richard's tailored tuxedo jacket bunched up awkwardly around his shoulders. He looked exactly like the desperate common thug he truly was. As the police hauled Richard down the stage steps and marched him toward the exit, Cynthia completely broke down. The illusion of her high society life had evaporated in a matter of minutes. She was no longer a wealthy socialite. She was a broke, exposed criminal standing in a room full of people who despised her. She let out a loud, agonizing sob that echoed across the ballroom. She scrambled forward, her expensive designer gown catching on her heels and tearing as she ran. She pushed past the remaining federal agents and practically threw herself at the base of the stage. She fell hard onto her bare knees right below where I was standing. She reached up and desperately grabbed the fabric of my suit trousers. "Theodore, please," she wailed hysterically, thick tears streaming down her face and ruining her expensive makeup. "You have to stop this. I was manipulated. Richard forced me to do all of it. He threatened me. I never wanted to hurt you. I am your wife. We were together for 40 years. You promised to always take care of me. Please, Theodore, do not let them take me to prison. I have nothing left." Her crying was loud and entirely pathetic. She was perfectly willing to throw her lover directly to the wolves the second her own freedom was threatened. She begged me for the very same mercy she had explicitly denied me when she handed me an eviction notice and tried to lock me in an asylum. I looked down at the woman weeping uncontrollably at my feet. I felt absolutely zero empathy. My face remained completely impassive. I reached inside the breast pocket of my bespoke suit jacket and pulled out a neatly folded document. I looked at Cynthia and spoke clearly into the microphone so the entire room could hear my final verdict. "You made your choice the night you kicked me out of the house I built for you," I said coldly. "You handed me divorce papers and demanded I leave. I simply obliged." I unfolded the document. It was the official finalized divorce decree, complete with the heavy red stamp of the state family court. Robert Hughes had expedited the filing using the exact same paperwork she had so arrogantly prepared and handed to me. I tossed the thick packet directly into her tear-stained face. The heavy paper hit her cheek and scattered across the floor around her knees. "You are legally no longer my wife," I stated. "I kept the commercial trust, the joint savings you tried to steal, and my absolute freedom. You get to keep your cheating lover and his mountain of federal restitution debt. Have a wonderful life, Cynthia." I turned my back on her screams and walked off the stage. While I was walking out of the Grand Plaza Hotel and leaving my ex-wife sobbing on the marble floor, a completely different type of justice was arriving at my former home. Kendrick and Megan were sitting in the living room surrounded by the shattered glass from the domestic brawl the night before. They were desperately trying to figure out how to salvage their fraudulent lifestyle after Megan had been humiliated and arrested at the bank earlier that day. Their frantic plotting was violently interrupted by the heavy pounding of fists on the front door. It was not a delivery driver or a friendly neighbor checking in. 3 county sheriffs stood on the porch. Their patrol cars were parked aggressively in the driveway with their red and blue lights flashing brightly against the pristine suburban houses. The lead sheriff held a thick metal clipboard. He did not ask for permission to enter the house. He stepped right into the foyer and handed Kendrick an official court-ordered eviction mandate. He explained with absolute legal authority that the recent property transfer was completely fraudulent. The house was legally owned by the Hayes Family Commercial Trust, and the trust had explicitly revoked their right to occupy the premises. Kendrick tried to argue. He stammered in a panic and pointed to the forged deed they had tricked me into signing. The sheriff cut him off immediately. He stated that the deed was a verified forgery and that possessing it was a serious felony. The sheriff gave them exactly 30 minutes to pack their essential personal items and vacate the property before they would be arrested for criminal trespassing. Megan began to scream hysterically, demanding to speak to a lawyer and asserting her fake high society status. But the officers simply folded their arms and started a stopwatch. The reality was absolute and inescapable. They were being thrown out onto the street. The neighbors they had tried so hard to impress were now standing on their lawns watching the disgrace unfold under the glaring police lights. The feeling of losing everything in a single instant is a very specific type of psychological trauma. Kendrick and Megan had spent the last 5 years building an elaborate illusion of superiority. They genuinely believed their ruthless ambition made them completely untouchable. They thought they had secured a lifetime of luxury by stabbing me in the back. Now, watching the armed sheriffs stand over them with their hands resting on their duty belts, that entire manufactured empire instantly evaporated into thin air. The corner office at the logistics center was completely gone because Richard was in federal custody. The stolen house was gone. The embezzled funds were frozen. They were experiencing the exact same absolute destitution they had so gleefully tried to force upon me just days prior. The sheer speed of their total collapse was staggering. They went from planning lavish country club events to being homeless criminals in a matter of hours. The universe has a profound way of balancing the scales when you build your entire existence on a foundation of cruel deception. Megan did not wait for the situation to stabilize. The second they were forced out onto the front driveway, her primal survival instincts took over completely. She looked at Kendrick standing on the curb with 2 black trash bags full of his clothes. She did not see her devoted husband or her life partner. She saw a massive sinking anchor that was going to drag her straight into a federal prison cell. Kendrick reached out to hold her hand, looking for some minor comfort in the total wreckage of their lives. Megan slapped his hand away with brutal force. She marched over to the trunk of her luxury SUV and threw her designer luggage inside. She turned back to Kendrick and unleashed a torrent of venomous rage. She blamed him for absolutely everything. She screamed that he was a complete failure who could not even successfully steal a house from a janitor. She told him that she was filing for an expedited divorce the very next morning to sever all legal ties to his incoming criminal convictions. Kendrick tried to reason with her. He pleaded with her to stay, claiming they still had a small reserve of emergency cash hidden in the vehicle glove compartment to rent a hotel room. Megan let out a sharp, wicked laugh. She reached into her expensive designer purse and pulled out the thick stack of $100 bills. She had already raided their emergency stash while the sheriffs were rushing them out the door. She looked Kendrick right in the eye and told him he was entirely on his own. "I am going to the district attorney tomorrow morning," Megan yelled over the loud engine noise. "I will tell them every single detail of your involvement with Richard Lawson. I am trading you for legal immunity." She climbed into her luxury vehicle, locked the heavy doors, and pressed the gas pedal. She did not look back in the rearview mirror as she sped down the quiet suburban street. She left her husband standing completely alone on the wet sidewalk, holding his garbage bags, watching his entire fake life drive away. The treacherous woman he had chosen over his own father had discarded him the exact second he ran out of money. Later that night, long after the wealthy guests had fled the gala and the federal agents had processed Richard at the precinct, a heavy rain began to fall across the city. I was sitting quietly in my cheap motel room reviewing the final legal documents Robert Hughes had prepared for the morning. A frantic, desperate pounding suddenly rattled the thin wooden door. I looked at the live feed from the hidden security camera I had installed in the hallway. Kendrick was standing in the freezing rain. He was soaked to the bone, shivering violently and clutching his cheap trash bags. He dropped to his bare knees on the hard concrete. He pressed his face against the door and began to sob uncontrollably. "Dad, please open the door," he cried out loudly. His voice was raw and incredibly pathetic. "I have absolutely nothing left. Megan took the car and the money. I am going to jail. Please, I am your son. Just give me one more chance to fix this." I stood up from my chair and walked over to the door. I stood just inches away from the wood. I could hear his jagged breathing through the thin barrier. I did not unlock the deadbolt. I did not turn the handle. I did not speak a single word of comfort. I simply turned the motel room light off and walked away. The door remained firmly shut. He had made his choice to live in the dark, and now he had to stay there alone. The wheels of justice grind slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine. 6 months after that freezing rainy night at the motel, I sat comfortably in the front row of the federal courthouse. The courtroom was dead silent as the presiding judge delivered the final, inescapable verdicts. Richard Lawson stood before the heavy wooden bench wearing a bright orange prison jumpsuit. He looked absolutely nothing like the polished, arrogant executive who had smirked at me from the comfort of my own bedroom. His shoulders were slumped, his face was gaunt, and his posture was completely broken. The judge did not hold back a single ounce of contempt. For his elaborate orchestration of multi-million-dollar corporate fraud, severe extortion, and the terrifying conspiracy to commit medical kidnapping, Richard was sentenced to a staggering 15 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. He wept openly as the bailiffs led him away in heavy steel shackles. Cynthia sat at the defense table looking absolutely hollow. Robert Hughes had systematically dismantled her entire life in civil court before the criminal trial even reached its conclusion. She was legally forced to liquidate every single asset she possessed, to pay harsh restitution for the $40,000 she stole and the massive legal fees she accumulated trying to defend herself. She was officially and completely bankrupt. The state seized the luxury silver convertible Richard had bought her. She walked out of that courthouse with nothing but a plastic garbage bag full of cheap clothes, heading straight to a dangerous city-run homeless shelter. Kendrick stood next to his overworked, court-appointed public defender. Megan had fully delivered on her malicious threat. She struck a rapid immunity deal with the ruthless prosecutors and testified extensively against him in exchange for her own freedom. Because of his eventual cooperation after the fact and his complete lack of prior felony convictions, the judge showed Kendrick a tiny, agonizing fraction of mercy. He was officially sentenced to 5 years of strict monitored probation and 3,000 hours of grueling manual community service. He narrowly avoided a concrete prison cell, but his corporate career was permanently annihilated. He would spend the next several years picking up roadside trash on the side of the highway while wearing a bright yellow safety vest, completely stripped of his former glory. With the criminal trials officially concluded, the massive logistical corporation that leased my commercial land had a monumental public relations disaster to urgently clean up. Their highly anticipated multi-billion-dollar international merger was hanging by a very thin, fragile thread. The corporate board of directors realized that their rogue regional director had nearly alienated the legal owner of their most vital distribution hub. They needed to make amends, and they needed to do it immediately. 2 days after the sentencing, a sleek black town car pulled up to the curb of the logistics center. I was standing proudly in the main lobby wearing a sharp, custom-tailored suit instead of my old, stained gray janitor uniform. The chief executive officer of the entire national corporation stepped out of the luxury vehicle and walked directly toward me. He was an older, highly distinguished man who usually only dealt with Wall Street bankers and powerful politicians. He bypassed his entire corporate entourage and extended his hand to me. He looked me squarely in the eye and offered a profound, unconditional apology for the severe financial mismanagement and the sheer personal disrespect I had endured under Richard's catastrophic leadership. The CEO did not just bring empty corporate apologies. He brought a highly lucrative, entirely restructured business proposition. The corporation desperately wanted to secure the 10-acre property for their permanent international expansion. They knew perfectly well that if I decided to terminate their lease out of spite, it would cost them hundreds of millions of dollars to relocate their massive logistical infrastructure. We walked together into the main executive boardroom. It was the exact same glass-enclosed room where Richard used to hold his morning meetings and bark condescending orders at the maintenance staff. I remembered spending countless hours scrubbing coffee stains out of that very carpet while the executives ignored my existence. Now I was sitting at the absolute head of the massive mahogany table. Robert Hughes sat right beside me, projecting total legal dominance. He opened his sleek leather briefcase and placed a newly drafted ironclad commercial leasing agreement on the polished wood. The terms we presented were completely non-negotiable. We demanded a massive exponential increase in the monthly lease payments, a comprehensive operational oversight clause that granted me full access to their financial records, and a substantial upfront signing bonus to compensate for the severe emotional distress caused by their former employee. The CEO read through the packet carefully. He did not argue. He did not attempt to negotiate the numbers down or alter a single paragraph. He recognized a total checkmate when he saw one. He picked up his gold fountain pen and signed the heavy document without a single moment of hesitation. I leaned forward and signed my own name right next to his. The dark ink dried instantly. I officially solidified my absolute dominance over the massive property my grandfather had purchased so long ago. I was no longer the invisible man sweeping the concrete floors in the middle of the dark night. I was the master of the domain. I held the keys to their entire regional operation. The corporate executives stood up, shook my hand respectfully, and addressed me exclusively as Mr. Hayes. They looked at me with the deep, quiet reverence reserved for a man who wielded genuine, unshakable power. I walked out of that boardroom feeling a profound sense of validation. The corporate badge they handed me was not for a maintenance worker. It was an all-access executive pass. I had reclaimed my rightful position at the top of the food chain. I dictated the terms of engagement on my own soil. The years of quiet observation and patient endurance had finally culminated in a spectacular corporate victory. I had transformed a broom into a scepter. The battlefield was finally completely clear. The treacherous enemies who had conspired to strip me of my dignity, my home, and my sanity were completely eliminated from my reality. They had dug their own shallow graves with their boundless greed and their arrogant assumptions. Richard would spend the rest of his natural life staring at gray concrete walls, completely stripped of his corporate power and his stolen wealth. Cynthia was wandering the dangerous city streets, relying on crowded soup kitchens for her daily meals, forever tormented by the memory of the immense luxury she had foolishly thrown away for a cheap thrill. Kendrick was trapped in a miserable cycle of grueling manual labor and strict probation check-ins, forever stained by a criminal record that would absolutely prevent him from ever working in a comfortable corporate office again. Megan had slithered back to her wealthy parents, but she was permanently disinherited and financially cut off due to the massive public humiliation she brought upon her proud family name. None of them would ever have the financial resources, the social credibility, or the legal opportunity to bounce back from this devastating collapse. They were completely and totally neutralized. The massive toxic shadow they had cast over my life was permanently erased. They had tried to bury me alive, but they forgot I owned the dirt. There would be no dramatic comebacks for any of them. There would be no second chances to plot another scheme. I had severed their lifelines entirely, leaving them to rot in the very consequences they had manufactured. The payback was absolute and unequivocally final. I returned to the suburban home that I had paid for with 30 years of blood and sweat. The sheriff department had completely cleared out the remaining traces of Kendrick and Megan months ago. Walking through the front door for the first time as the undisputed master of my domain felt like breathing pure oxygen after years of suffocating underwater. I did not just move back in and settle for the memories of a broken marriage. I hired the most prestigious architectural remodeling firm in the city. I instructed them to completely gut the interior. I wanted every single trace of Cynthia and her superficial country club aesthetic permanently erased from my property. The obnoxious crystal chandeliers she had purchased to impress her phony socialite friends were ripped out and thrown directly into a construction dumpster. The master bedroom, the exact room where I had caught her betraying our 4 decades of marriage with Richard Lawson, was stripped down to the bare wooden studs. The old bed was hauled away to a landfill. I replaced it all with rich, dark mahogany flooring, solid oak fixtures, and expansive bay windows that let the morning sun pour into the house. I furnished the space with genuine leather seating and robust, elegant artwork that reflected my actual heritage and personal taste. I transformed a house of lies into an absolute fortress of peace. I no longer woke up at 3 in the afternoon with my spine screaming in agony from hauling heavy trash bins all night. I no longer smelled of industrial bleach and warehouse exhaust. I woke up naturally at dawn. I brewed expensive imported coffee in a pristine kitchen. I sat on my newly constructed back patio and simply listened to the birds singing. The sheer tranquility of financial freedom and absolute solitude was intoxicating. I had spent my entire adult life sacrificing my comfort to provide a luxurious safety net for a family of ungrateful parasites. Now every single dollar my massive commercial lease generated was mine to enjoy. I walked through the spacious, echoing halls of my beautifully renovated home and felt a profound sense of absolute ownership. I had reclaimed my territory. With the house fully restored and my daily life entirely devoid of toxic drama, I turned my attention to the massive influx of capital pouring in from the logistics center lease. I had absolutely no desire to hoard the wealth like a greedy dragon. I knew firsthand how incredibly difficult it was for young, hardworking African-American men and women to build a legitimate business from the ground up without a financial safety net. I remembered the $150,000 I had wasted bailing Kendrick out of his lazy, poorly managed startup venture. I decided to take the resources my son had foolishly squandered and redirect them toward individuals who actually possessed genuine character. I sat down with Robert Hughes and legally established the Theodore Hayes Excellence Fund. We structured it as a robust, independently managed scholarship and small business grant program. It was specifically designed to provide completely debt-free seed money and university tuition to underprivileged African American youth who demonstrated exceptional academic merit and a relentless work ethic. I wanted to build a legacy of actual empowerment, completely insulated from the entitlement that had destroyed my own son. A few weeks after officially launching the foundation, I decided to take a quiet afternoon drive across the city. I needed to pick up a specific brand of organic soil for my newly landscaped garden, and the only place that carried it was a massive warehouse-style discount supermarket on the less affluent side of town. I was wearing a tailored charcoal overcoat, a crisp white button-down shirt, and polished leather loafers. I looked like a man who had not known a single day of stress in his life. I walked through the sliding automatic doors and navigated the crowded, brightly lit aisles with a calm and steady pace. I turned the corner into the heavy gardening section. The aisle was mostly empty save for a single employee working near the back shelves. The worker was hunched over a bright yellow plastic mop bucket, aggressively scrubbing a sticky spill off the scuffed linoleum floor. She was wearing a terribly ill-fitting cheap polyester uniform that was stained with cleaning chemicals. Her hair was pulled back into a messy, frayed knot, exposing graying, unkempt roots that desperately needed professional attention. I heard a rough, exhausted cough echo from her chest. I continued walking down the aisle. The rhythmic squeak of her cheap rubber sole shoes against the wet floor stopped abruptly. The worker slowly stood up and turned around to grab a caution sign. We locked eyes. The plastic wet floor sign slipped out of her hands and clattered loudly against the linoleum. It was Cynthia. The woman who had spent 40 years demanding expensive diamonds and luxury vehicles was standing in front of me holding a filthy mop. The harsh, unflattering fluorescent lights of the discount supermarket illuminated every single harsh reality of her new life. Without Richard and his embezzled corporate funds to finance her expensive skincare routines and daily salon visits, she looked completely destroyed. Her face was gaunt, deeply lined with profound stress, and completely drained of its former arrogant vitality. The heavy physical toll of manual labor had clearly broken her posture. The absolute irony of the situation hit me like a freight train. She had viciously mocked me for being a blue-collar janitor. She had explicitly told me that a man who swept floors did not belong in her high society world. Now she was the one wearing the stained uniform cleaning up spills for minimum wage just to survive. Cynthia stared at me. Her eyes widened in absolute shock as she took in my tailored clothes and my healthy, vibrant appearance. The sheer realization of exactly what she had thrown away crashed down upon her in real time. Her eyes rapidly filled with thick, agonizing tears. Her bottom lip began to tremble violently. She took a hesitant, desperate step toward me. She opened her mouth, her voice cracking as she prepared to beg for mercy, to plead for a second chance, to ask for just a fraction of the life she had so carelessly destroyed. I did not stop walking. I did not slow my pace. I did not offer her a cruel smirk, a mocking laugh, or a vindictive insult. Hatred and anger require an investment of emotional energy. Cynthia was absolutely no longer worth a single drop of my energy. I looked right through her, as if she were made of completely transparent glass. I looked at her the exact same way one looks at a forgotten piece of scenery. I stepped smoothly around the yellow wet floor sign, completely bypassing her trembling outstretched hand. I felt the air shift as I walked past her, leaving her entirely alone in the cold fluorescent aisle. I did not look back over my shoulder. I heard a soft, gut-wrenching sob break the silence behind me, the sound of a woman realizing her absolute irrelevance. I selected the organic soil I needed, paid at the front register, and walked out into the bright, crisp afternoon sunlight. The sheer indifference I showed her was the absolute ultimate punishment. It was infinitely more devastating than any angry words I could have ever spoken. I had completely erased her from my universe. A few days after my brief and profoundly satisfying encounter with Cynthia at the discount supermarket, I drove downtown to meet with Robert Hughes for one final, highly specific legal maneuver. While I had absolutely no sympathy left for my ex-wife or my treacherous son, there was one completely innocent life caught in the crossfire of their massive collapse: my 10-year-old grandson. He did not ask to be born to a mother as ruthlessly greedy as Megan, or a father as fundamentally weak and inherently dishonest as Kendrick. I refused to let the heavy sins of his parents destroy his future potential. I sat across the mahogany desk from Robert and instructed him to establish a new, completely impenetrable educational trust fund specifically designated for the boy. We structured the legal framework with absolute paranoia and military precision. I mandated that the funds could only be dispersed directly to accredited academic institutions. The money would strictly cover his university tuition, his required textbooks, his campus housing, and his meal plans. We installed an independent third-party corporate fiduciary to oversee every single financial transaction. This completely eliminated any possibility of familial interference. Kendrick and Megan were permanently and legally barred from acting as custodians over the account. They could not authorize a withdrawal, they could not request a cash reimbursement for supposed childhood expenses, and they absolutely could not leverage the trust against their own mounting personal debts. I knew perfectly well that Megan, despite being disinherited by her own wealthy parents, would eventually try to claw her way back into the boy's financial orbit the second she realized there was capital available. I made absolutely sure that if she ever tried to call the corporate fiduciary to demand a cash payout, she would hit a solid brick wall of aggressive corporate lawyers. My grandson would have every single academic opportunity in the world. He would never have to take out a crippling student loan or work the grueling, soul-crushing night shifts that I endured to pay off someone else's mistakes. He would have a completely clean slate to build an honorable life. But his parents would never see a single dime of that money. I secured the innocent bloodline while permanently starving the parasites. Sitting in Robert's corner office finalizing those strict legal documents solidified a profound realization I had been wrestling with for several months. Money is not just a tool for standard commerce. It is the ultimate truth serum. I spent decades actively hiding my massive generational wealth because I mistakenly believed that a modest blue-collar lifestyle would inherently teach my family humility, honor, and a strong work ethic. I was completely wrong. Greed is a fundamental rot that exists entirely independent of a bank balance. It lives deep inside the bone. Cynthia and Kendrick did not betray me because they were financially desperate. They betrayed me because they lacked a basic moral compass. I learned the absolute hardest lesson a man can learn in his golden years. You absolutely cannot purchase loyalty, and you can never buy genuine love. True wealth is not defined by the sheer size of your commercial real estate portfolio or the massive balance in your corporate trust accounts. True wealth is possessing the absolute self-respect to walk away from toxic people who only view you as a disposable financial resource. It is the raw, unshakable power to establish permanent boundaries and aggressively enforce them without feeling a single ounce of guilt. I left the downtown law firm that afternoon and drove back to my fully renovated suburban sanctuary. The heavy oak front door clicked shut behind me, firmly sealing out the noise and chaos of the outside world. I walked straight through the pristine, elegantly furnished living room and stepped out onto my expansive back patio. The late afternoon had transitioned into a cool, magnificent evening, but it is the mornings that I truly cherish now. The next day, I woke up naturally at 6 o'clock without a screaming alarm clock or the agonizing pain of a ruined back forcing me out of bed. I walked into my custom kitchen and brewed a pot of the most expensive, rich imported coffee beans I could find. I poured the dark steaming liquid into a heavy ceramic mug and walked outside. The air was crisp, clean, and completely pure. I sat down in a plush leather patio chair and looked out over the meticulously manicured lawn and the vibrant, blooming flower beds the professional landscaping team had just finished planting. I took a slow, deep sip of the coffee. The complex, robust flavor rolled over my tongue. I closed my eyes and simply listened to the world. There were no loud warehouse sirens. There were no heavy diesel trucks backing up to a concrete loading dock. There were no condescending orders barked by arrogant regional directors. There was only the gentle rustling of the wind through the tall oak trees and the soft, peaceful chirping of the morning birds. The sheer tranquility of this absolute freedom was entirely intoxicating. For over 5 years, I had spent this exact hour of the morning driving home from a grueling night shift, my hands smelling strongly of industrial bleach, and my spirit completely crushed under the heavy weight of my son's massive financial failures. I used to pull into this exact driveway feeling like a hollow, exhausted ghost of a man. Now I sat on my throne with a completely clear conscience and an aggressively protected peace. The phone did not ring with manufactured emergencies. Nobody demanded my money. Nobody questioned my authority or tested my limits. I had surgically excised the cancer from my life. I was breathing pure, unadulterated oxygen. I owned my time, I owned my territory, and I owned my future. I do not spend my days wondering how Richard Lawson is adjusting to his concrete federal prison cell. I do not waste a single second of my valuable mental energy picturing Kendrick picking up garbage on the side of a busy interstate while wearing a humiliating bright yellow probation vest. I certainly do not think about Cynthia pushing a filthy mop bucket down the fluorescent aisles of a discount supermarket for minimum wage. Hatred and revenge require a sustained emotional investment that those treacherous people simply do not deserve. I delivered my absolute judgment, executed the punishment with flawless precision, and completely erased them from my universe. They thought I was a tired, blind old fool they could easily discard. They believed they were the apex predators hunting a weak, defenseless animal. They learned the devastating truth far too late. I was never their prey. I was the architect of their total destruction. I gave them exactly what they earned. They have to live in the darkness they created for themselves, while I am enjoying my own sunrise. If there is one final lesson I can leave you with, it is the absolute power of silence. When you are betrayed by the people you love the most, your first instinct is to scream, to confront them, and to demand immediate answers. Do not do it. Anger is loud, but true power is completely silent. When you stay quiet, you give toxic people the space they need to hang themselves with their own rope. They will underestimate you. They will get sloppy. They will expose their entire hand while you quietly build your fortress. Never show your cards until you are ready to end the game. If you found strength in my story today, please share this video with someone who needs to remember their own worth and hit that subscribe button for more stories of absolute justice.